Well, good morning again, everyone, and thank you for being with us. And I just want to share some ideas about Easter itself and kind of encourage each and every one of us, as we did in the opening treatment, encourage each and every one to find the meaning that is appropriate for you today. What does it mean to you today? Next year it'll mean something else. Last year it meant something totally different. What does it mean today? As I said with the opening quote from Rumi, silence is the language of God. Everything else is an insufficient translation. This goes along with the teaching in the Upanishads. That which is beyond words, but from which words come. That which is beyond thoughts, but from which thoughts come. I think what we have to realize is that in our human experience, the majority of the experience that we have had in this lifetime on this planet, we have been working with what we'll call mind, although I think if you go look for a definition of mind, you'll get many, which goes back to the point of insufficient translations. We use words, not entirely sure what they mean. We use words in a manner that means something to us, and we assume that they mean the same thing to everybody else, and they don't. They don't. We have to accept that. They don't. We speak of God, we speak of love, we speak of Easter, we speak of all these things. And we have to stop for a moment and recognize that what the intellect tries to make of them, what language tries to make of them, what concepts, and then we try to find words to express the concepts, all of these things are an insufficient translation. It's the best we have right now, but it's insufficient. So on Sundays, what happens is, in my preparation, I get into this place which is beyond words, and then somehow have to try to find words to express that. And it's always incomplete, it's always insufficient, and it always will be, because our language fails us. So what I'm inviting everyone to do today is, while you hear these words, let something else go on inside your heart. Let your heart find the meaning, find the message that is appropriate for you today. In the New Testament, we have several examples that are attributed to Jesus speaking. And it's very interesting what he said. He said, "Let he who has ears hear. Let he who has eyes see." Now, what does that mean? If you have ears, unless there's something not functioning, if you have ears, you hear. If you have eyes, you see. That is the normal natural state of being. So why do people who have ears have to be told to hear? Why do people who have eyes, why do they have to be told to see? And Dr. Rocco Errico, who tries to help us understand the culture from which these teachings come, tells us that was not a warning, not a danger warning, but it was a notice, it was an advisory. Jesus was telling the people that the true message, the true importance, was not the words that they were hearing. It was not the images that they were seeing, that there was something much, much deeper going on. This is what I'm saying is, this is what we have to know in our hearts. We have to be in the silence and listen to the language of God. And we must step away from insufficient translations. That's what I'm inviting everyone to do today. What does Easter mean to you? Not in your head, not in words, not in images, but in your heart. What does it mean to you? Now, last week we talked a little bit about the setting of Holy Week in Palestine at the time. And we have to kind of look at things a couple different ways. Right? What was going on historically? What is the historical context in which these events took place? And we have to look at the culture. What was the cultural context in which these things took place? But most importantly, we have to look at the spiritual context, which is a personal context, which is, what does it mean to me today? I love the quote from the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama says this frequently. He says, how can it be that there are many religions and there's only one religion? And he said, well, there are many people. And there's one religion that is right for each person. And each one must find and practice that religion that is right for them. And I think we have to dig even deeper and say, well, what does this word religion mean? What does this mean when we talk about religion? Because typically we jump into a denomination, you know. Are we this denomination or that denomination or another denomination? But if we take religion at its root, it means to bind together, to bind together. The same as yoga, to yoke together. Right? Jesus told us that the yoke is sweet and the burden is light. So if we think about this higher level meaning of religion, it's trying to bind something together, trying to bring something together, trying to yoke something together. But what is it trying to yoke together? And why aren't these things that it's trying to yoke together, why aren't they already together? See, this is kind of the fundamentals that we get into of what is our spiritual journey, your personal spiritual journey. What is a spiritual journey? What is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to experience as we go about this journey or this evolution of the soul. And Dr. Holmes tells us that if something is evolving, it is evolving from a principle. Right? It's evolving from something and it's evolving toward something. Life is evolving from the principle of life. If we can step back far enough and as Emerson says, get our bloated nothingness out of the way, we can see that there's this something called life, that we call life. And it is expressing itself in many different ways. But it supports itself entirely, with all of its different ways. The trees are alive. The life principle exists in them. The trees are alive. We are alive. The life principle exists within us. And we and the trees support each other, right? In a relationship, a most important relationship, a most intimate relationship. The air that we breathe is the air the trees exhale. The air that the trees breathe is the air that we exhale. We exchange the gases that are essential for each of us to live, and yet from the appearances we are quite different. Right? We move, we can get up, we can have will, we can have volition, we can decide. The trees just seem to stay in one place. Of course, over time we're learning more and more, and you see different things. Now we're being told that trees actually can communicate through their roots, there's a language that they have, or a sensory communication of some sort. We can practice. We can actually practice if we go into a dark place, to deep wood. We can actually practice, and we can learn to see the glow that the trees put off, right? The aura, if you want to call it that, the life energy itself. So the same life energy that animates these trees animates us. We are part of the same whole, you see. There is this thing called life. There is this principle called life. And we are together, us and the trees and the animals and the plants. We are all evolving from it. And if we look at the lines of evolution, if we look at each step forward, if you want to call it that, or each leap forward, or each time that evolution has produced something totally new and different, if you go back to the talk a few weeks ago that said, don't just renew, reinvent. There are times when evolution just invents or seems to invent something totally new. And each of those leaps has been to produce something with a greater freedom and a greater degree of intelligence. That is us, you see. That is you and I. So we must be evolving from intelligence. We must be evolving from freedom. And we must be evolving towards discovering more of it as us. This is our spiritual nature. Divine love has created us out of itself. It has left us alone to make that discovery, right? And our spiritual journey then is discovering more and more, consistently, persistently, stubbornly, more and more of just how magnificent this divine life as us is. This is our spiritual journey. And what I'm suggesting today is that this time of the year that we call Easter has so many different meanings and so many different traditions over the years. If you just stop and look at it, the kids are all out with their baskets this morning and they're collecting Easter eggs, dyed eggs, beautifully hand decorated eggs. And they're putting them in their little baskets and they're taking them in their houses. What do Easter eggs have to do with Easter as a religious holiday? So this idea then, I just need to finish this idea then that there is one religion that is right for each person is there's one path, you see, there's one path that we take that's going to help us more so than any other. It is going to help us on this spiritual journey, this journey of discovering where we come from, this journey of discovering where we are going. The big questions in life, right? Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? That is our quest. That is our journey. One of the early philosophers of the Christian church, I can't remember whether it was Aquinas or Augustine, it was one of the two, said that we would not have the desire to pray if God had not first placed it in our hearts. We would not have the desire to pray if God had not first placed it in our hearts. We have been created to seek. Meister Eckhart, the 13th century or 12th century, somewhere around there, mystic from Germany, he lived around the year 1300, so you tell me what century that was. But he said He said, God is like the child who clears its throat while playing hide and seek to be sure that it is discovered. In the teachings from the East, in the teachings from Hinduism and Buddhism, we have a slightly different concept. In Judaism and Christianity, we have this idea of the fall, that human beings, Adam and Eve, were at once, they were very close to the divine. They walked with God in the cool of the evening, but then they left the garden. They were cast out of the garden, you see. When they started to believe in duality of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil, not the reality of good and evil. In the East, we have a different concept of the fall, and that is that as pure consciousness started to descend into matter, to cloak itself in matter, it had to shed some of its intelligence temporarily. So pure consciousness, which is what we would envision the divine to be, pure consciousness is sort of asleep in matter. The intelligence works at the level of the mineral, The intelligence works at the level of the plant. But with each leap of evolution, that intelligence, that consciousness emerges to a greater degree. And then we come along, human beings capable of being self-aware. Now that's not to say that we practice it, but we are capable of it. We are capable of it. And this self-awareness in the silence that is the language of God. You see, this is where our revelations come from. This is where our realizations come from. This is where our inspiration comes from. This is where our intuition comes from. So the first thing that I would like you to consider today, and this is for your consideration, and I invite you to take this into the silence during the week and see what comes to your heart, is that you and I have been created to seek this binding together, right? This yoking, this religious experience of coming back into the fullness of the realization that we are one with the magnificence that has created us. And this time of separation, this time of living in ignorance, if you wish to think of it that way, instead of thinking of it as a punishment, think of it as a time that was necessary for us to develop uniqueness, to develop our individual personalities. See, if the divine had created us fully enlightened, we would never be an individual, but we would all be exactly the same. Dr. Holmes calls it automatons. And automatons were little elaborate machines that you could wind up, and they moved, and they did all kinds of different things. They had birds that would chirp, and they had people that would walk, and they had all these different things, But they had no will, they had no volition. They just did. They just did what they were built to do. But the divine needed or wanted an individualized expression of itself to enjoy its creation uniquely through us and as us, to create anew through us and as us. And that which is and always is and never changes is constantly changing as us. That's the dichotomy being and becoming. The divine is, it is being, but it is becoming something unique as us. And what we are doing as we are growing, if we are growing intentionally, this is if we become self-aware and if we practice self-awareness and if we awaken to the spiritual magnificence that is within us, which is what I'm suggesting Easter is about, then we come back home. In the words of Judy Collins, we're trying to get ourselves back into the garden. So we have all of these different kind of traditions around Easter. We have Easter eggs, we have little chicks, we have all of these different things. And Easter and even the name Easter goes back thousands of years before Christianity. In its origins, it had to do with fertility and the abundance of life that was coming back in the spring in the northern hemisphere. The abundance of life in the southern hemisphere is in a different month. But the same ideas will be there. People had gone through a long winter. They had gone through a period where they were living off of what they took in last year. They had stored up the food. They had reduced their flocks to the bare minimum that they would need for breeding the following year, so they'd have less to feed. And when that solstice occurred in December, when that winter solstice occurred, it was celebrated because it was the promise of life renewing itself. Because as surely as the day grew 1 second longer, as surely as that happened, spring would come. And with spring would come the planting, and with planting would come the harvest. And when the fall came, they would take in what they had sown. So the earliest recognitions that we can think of is people celebrating the return of life from the winter. The animals began reproducing again. The crops began growing in the field, and people had this to celebrate. Now, if we just look at it from a historical context, we can say, well, yes, of course, if you grew up on a farm, it would be an important time, There'd be a lot of work to be done. There'd be fields to plow. There would be seeds to sow, there would be animals to breed, there would be fences to fix, there would be all of these things, and days would be growing longer, and the weather would be getting prettier, and that would just simply be at a purely human historical context. But you see, people took it further than that because we have been born to seek. So I think it was Socrates who gave us the ladder of love and the ladder of beauty. It was Plato or Socrates. I think it was Socrates. And he says, you and I start out with something very personal to us. Beauty, for example. We may look at our beloved and say, oh my God, they're so beautiful. We may pick a flower and say, oh, it is so beautiful. We may see the sunrise or the sunset, and we may think, oh, it is so beautiful. There is some personal way that we experience beauty. But then we realize that beauty is not just limited to that one person or that one flower or that one sunrise or that one sunset. Beauty is a principle, you see. As life is a principle, beauty is a principle. And now we can start to admire beauty in more than just that one personal, specific instance. We may start to recognize that other people are beautiful, and other flowers are beautiful, and other sunrises are beautiful, and other sunsets are beautiful. And we may start to recognize that beauty goes beyond what we can see. Maybe beauty goes to the music that we can hear. You see, And then we might start to realize, these things that we call beautiful, the reason that we recognize them as beautiful is there's a certain harmony to them. There's a certain balance to them, you see. The music, which is harmonious, is beautiful, you know. A child banging on a piano, not so much. So we start to think, well, this thing that we recognize as beauty is harmony, you see. And things that fit together well are harmonious. And if there is a principle of harmony, there is something before that, something beyond that. And then we think about the divine and we think, well, the divine must be the epitome of harmony. Because everything it has created out of itself. So therefore, each and everything must be some part of itself, and each and every part of itself must work well with each and every other part of itself. And this is why we and the trees can breathe each other's breath, because we are part of the one whole. And now, from starting with this little specific personal example of that which we call beautiful, we have climbed this ladder of beauty. And we recognize that beauty, what we recognize as beautiful, is the presence and the activity of the divine in that situation. And of course, the things that we don't recognize as beautiful, well, those are the things where we just haven't yet recognized the presence and the activity of the divine. So we can look at Easter and we can say, well, Easter was kind of it was a spring ritual where people were just reconnecting with nature. You see. But then the next level is by reconnecting with nature, by understanding the abundance of life, by understanding that life is eternal, that which appeared to be dead keeps coming back to life. You see, then we start to understand something of the nature of life itself. And then we start to wonder, what is the source of this life? Is life as we know it a chemical accident of the universe? Or is there something more? So you see, it leads us back. It leads us back. This is the path of religion. This is the path of yoking. It leads us back to identifying with and realizing through the experience of the heart, not of the intellect, not of the head, because these words are insufficient. These words don't get it. There's something so much deeper that we have to feel. So then we start to come to a spiritual interpretation, a spiritual interpretation. What is this thing that we call spirit? What is this thing that we call the divine? What is this thing? This is why every January we go back to the thing itself. What is this thing? What do we mean? What do we even understand what we mean when we are talking about God, or we're talking about love, or we're talking about the divine? And we come to this realization, the best interpretation that we can have for it is that spirit is the life principle before it cloaks itself in form. Now, this is a physical impossibility, because spirit, Dr. Holmes tells us, has always cloaked itself in form, and it will always cloak itself in form, and it always has to cloak itself in form, because that's how it expresses itself. But yet we realize that the form, the body, is not the principle of life. The body is an expression of the principle of life, but the body is not the principle of life. We start to come to this spiritual interpretation that you and I are more than the sum total of the chemicals in our body. I remember in high school, one of our teachers, or one of the kids in the class, said, you know, if you took the human body and you reduced it to all of its chemical components, it would be worth about 97 cents. This was in the 60s, right? So we'd have to account for inflation now. But yet if you took $1 worth of chemicals and gave them to a chemist and said, here, animate the body, they couldn't do it. See, there's something else there that is using the $1 worth of chemicals. There's something there that animates it, and this is the Spirit. So in Easter, when we come to the Easter holiday as we know it today in Christendom, and when we come to the Easter holiday today, it is a most important holiday. I would say it's the most important holiday in Christianity. Remember I said last week that when the Puritans first came to America, which by the way, some of my people were there, it was against the law to close your shop on Christmas Day. People shouldn't be celebrating Christmas. They should be celebrating Easter, because Easter was the most important holiday. But you see, there's something within us that wants to express. There's something within us that is seeking. And there's something within the human soul that knows that there's something worth celebrating both at the time of Christmas and at the time of Easter. And at Christmas time, we are celebrating the beginning, the birth, if you will, the beginning of our realization that the presence of the divine is right here in us, as us, and through us. And Easter, what we are celebrating, is stepping into the fullness of the experience of our spiritual nature. See, what I'm inviting us to do is to step out of the role of a passive observer. You know, see, we can look at these events as if they were somebody else's life, as if somebody else was doing them, and it was just something to be observed, sort of like watching a TV program. You know, oh yeah, these things happened thousands of years ago, but that doesn't help us to grow. There's a time when we do that. There's a time when that's appropriate in our growth. When I was a young child, I told you, you know, we went to parochial school and they took us to church every Sunday. We sat by class. We wore our school uniforms. We sat by grade. The first grade up front, second grade behind, all the way back to the taller kids, the 8th grade. But the very, very front rows of the church were reserved for the school children. And we watched what was going on, you know. And when I was a kid, it was even in a different language. It was in Latin. Had no idea intellectually what was going on. There was a man wearing robes up there. There were boys wearing robes up there. There was all this stuff going on in a different language. And we learned, you see, we learned when it was time to kneel down and when it was time to stand up and when it was time to sing and when it was time to leave and all those things. And it was probably a necessary stage of development so that later we could start to put context and meaning to it. But at the very beginning, it could have been anything going on up there. I had no understanding of it, see. And I think when we look back, when we read a story as if we have nothing to do with it because it happened 2,000 years ago, we're kind of in that mode of being a detached observer. And what I'm asking us to do is put yourself in that play. Make yourself the character in that play and ask yourself, what does this mean to me personally? What does this mean to me personally? So as I say, there's all these different ways that we could look at Easter. We could look at eggs and what the eggs mean, and abundance and lavishness and all these things, and what the chicks mean, and what do bunny rabbits mean, and all of these things. But the real thing I want you to think about today is, what does the resurrection mean to you? Now again, I'm going to give you the same 2 books that I gave you last week. I'm going to mention those, and I think they're important books to have on your bookshelf. The first is by John Dominic Crossman, And the title is Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. And he tries to set the historical context of what was going on in those days with Rome occupying Palestine, with the cruelty of the Roman occupiers, with crucifixion as a vile form of not only punishment but intimidation. He really helps us to understand the political context of what was going on. And the other book is Thomas Sheehan, The First Coming. And Sheehan is looking at it from a point of view of spiritually, what does Easter mean? When did Jesus become the Christ? Jesus the man, the Christ, the man who recognizes that the presence of the divine is in him, you see. And Thomas Sheehan tells us in his book, and now his book was written, I read it maybe 25 years ago, so I don't know if there's been any recent discovery since then. But what Sheehan tells us to consider in his book is that some of the oldest manuscripts of New Testament scripture does not contain the Easter story. It ends with the crucifixion. And according to Sheehan, it was in later years, you see, that this story started to evolve, started to enter. And if you read through the Gospels, you can kind of see how over time things got added into the Easter story, The guards were put outside the tomb, and then the big stone was rolled outside the tomb. And this was to prevent people from stealing the body and claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead when it was all some kind of a big trick. And you can kind of see people saying, well, Jesus rose from the dead. And they say, oh, no, somebody just stole his body. Come on, get real. Oh, no, you couldn't steal his body. See, there was guards at the gate. And then there was a stone at the tomb, and nobody could go in there and roll it away. See? And then, of course, that presented later problems, which is, well, what happened to the guards and what happened to the stone on the resurrection morning? There's even differences if for people who really get into it, that go into the stories and kind of nitpick things apart. According to one gospel, the crucifixion would have been on Thursday, and then another it would be on Friday. According to one, Mary Magdalene was the first person to see the risen Jesus, and according to another, it was Peter, see? And these things, people spend lots and lots of time arguing about them. And what I'm saying is, but what does it mean to you personally? What does it mean to you personally? And what I want to ask you to consider is the stone. The stone. See, to me, the symbolism, to me, the meaning, if I was to put myself in that situation, if I was to consider myself, what does that mean to me? If I was this person, what does this mean to me of this person whose body goes into the tomb? Right? And you can see the bookends there, right? The authors of the New Testament, they have Jesus coming into the world from the virgin womb, and the last place he exists in the world is the virgin tomb. This is a literary construct. But what does this mean then? What is it all about? And to me, what it's all about is dying to the belief that I am just a physical being, and awakening fully to the realization that I am a spiritual being. See, in the spiritual realm, there is no birth, there is no death, there is change. Life takes on one form, it sheds that form, it takes on another form. This is what ancient people saw in the renewal of springtime. A tree falls in the forest and many trees sprout from its trunk. Right? If you've ever tried to kill a hedge that's growing in the wrong place in your yard, you'll know that life continues on. No matter how close to the ground I cut those things, they always keep coming back up. So people saw this, and just like with beauty, they looked at that and they said, oh, it's not just a tree, you see. Life itself persists and exists before and after any physical form. So the meaning that I a sign for myself, and I am inviting you to make your own discovery. Go deeper than the insufficient translations that we have all used and we have all been given over the years. Go into your heart, go into the silence and ask yourself, but what does this mean to me? What does this mean to me? And what I get from it, as insufficiently as I can explain it, is that this is the journey of each and every soul. This is the journey of each and every one of us. At some point, we have the Christmas experience where we recognize the presence of the divine within us, but it is tiny, you see, it is small, it is weak, it is a baby. It has to be nurtured, it has to grow, but at some point it grows into the fullness of its spiritual nature, and at that point the spiritual nature supersedes the physical. We no longer relate to ourselves in physical terms. We no longer think of ourselves in physical terms. We no longer fear death, because death is a transition. It is a change. But then there's the stone. Most perplexing, you see, most perplexing, because what this narrative is telling us is that the power of the divine was able to take that which was dead and bring it back to life. It is telling us, if we read on through the Acts of the Apostles, that the risen Jesus was able to just suddenly transport himself over great distances, that he was able to pass through closed doors and enter sealed rooms, you see. Why did the stone have to be rolled back? Why did we need an earthquake or angels to come and roll the stone back and disable the guards? Why does the stories need that? And to me, the stone represents the obstacles in our own consciousness. The only reason that we need to be yoked together is because we have undergone this experience, this temporary experience of separation. And by becoming self-aware, and through our study and through our practice, we are bringing ourselves, we are bringing ourselves back, because no one can do it for us. We are bringing ourselves back into the experience of the unity. But the stone represents the obstacles in our consciousness. These are the things that we believe to be true that are not true, that are ideas of separation. The idea that I am only human. the idea that someday I will die. The idea that I am different than each and every other person, and not seeing the unity and the oneness and the love and the presence of the divine in each and everything. All of these ideas are ideas of separation, and our spiritual growth then is one of rolling back those stones. And only we can roll back the stone. There's no angel going to come do it for us. There's no earthquake going to come do it for us. In our practice, in our spiritual practice, we must be willing daily to catch ourselves. See, this is the interesting part about being human. We can catch ourselves being human. And we can catch ourselves when an idea enters our mind and comes out of our mouth, and that idea is less than spiritual. So what I am suggesting then is this. If you read Sheehan, and I strongly urge you to read Sheehan, what Sheehan is telling us is that the oldest manuscripts that they found did not have the Easter story in it, because the Easter story may have been a spiritual realization for these original followers of Jesus. It may have been that one day they said, oh my goodness, Do you know who that was? Do you know what this means? And they started to understand that the presence of the divine was right there in their midst, and they missed it. Now, whether that's true or not, I can't tell you. I don't know. It's a suggestion that helps us to think, but what does it mean to me? Is the presence of the divine right here within me, in my midst, as me, and through me? But I don't recognize it. I don't see it. I am so caught up in my head. I am so caught up in the intellect. I am so caught up in the language of words and concepts and thoughts and ideas that I have not taken the time to listen to my heart. Catch yourself when you are only being human. Stop and roll back your stone and go within to the silence. Just remind yourself as you're going in that God is all there is. Sit. Be still. Know. Discover yourself as a spiritual being and come back into the world resurrected and born again in spirit. That's my interpretation. Each must find their own. I invite you this week, take time to do so. And so it is. And let's see, I think Reverend Laurie has picked out a treatment for us today.